So today we're talking about Jesus Christ. And it's important to put both those words in there for a number of different reasons. One of the interesting things about when I first came to St. Francis was that I noticed that it was okay to say Christ. Jesus was a little harder for some people. I used to say that that was the one swear word at St. Francis. Bishop Spong almost goes the opposite direction, where he talks more about Jesus, but not about Christ as much. I think the difficulty of this space is what to do. And I realize, for example, why Bishop Spong does what he does. It's because he has seen Christ elevated to God, where they're really talking about God. They're really saying Jesus is the whole of God. And he's trying very hard to avoid that. So let me tell you a story about when I first started pastoring. I was at a church in Phoenix that was right along Central Avenue. Central Avenue that got tons of cars every single day, very busy street, right? And this sat right on the corner where all those cars went by. And outside their front door, they built it in the 50s, right outside the front door of the church, they put this image. It's gorgeous, right? Made out of Italian marble. What's important is what's here at the top. Or at least I think this is why they thought it was important. That this Jesus who was looking out over the street at all these people going by said, "Is it nothing to you, all ye that pass by?" Are you just passing by and avoiding Christ, right? Are you just passing by and not seeing this place of Jesus? Bishop Spong, I think it's in the Why Christianity Must Change or Die, entitles one of his chapters after a scripture that says, what do you believe about, I forget what it said. What think ye of Christ? Right, and he uses that in some of the writings from the new Christianity as well. So I want to start with that. What think ye of Christ? As you go through life, what causes you to stop and look at the Jesus, right? Not just the figurine on the middle of Central Avenue, but what makes you stop and look at Christ, Jesus? What compels you?
I don't know whether it's to make me stop and look at Jesus, but I think one of the things that I consider is, and when I think about Jesus, I think about the juxtaposition of the gentleness with the strength.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a hard road to be both gentle and strong.
Yeah.
And most men, I won't say most, I shouldn't say most when I don't really know, but many Americans feel that strength is much more important than anything else.
Right. Especially in the male side of things.
Yes, but women have a kind of strength too. I
Absolutely.
think that they want to, that they try to maintain. They may not call it that, but I think that they do try to maintain it.
Yeah.
And feel that it is very important, like standing up to your kids.
Mm-hmm.
That is certainly one form of it. But to have both the strength and the gentleness, to me, is one way in which Jesus is complete. Not even considering what part of the deity Jesus may or may not be, but he is a complete being that way, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question though. I have heard some ministers say Jesus the Christ.
Yeah, Jesus the Christ, absolutely.
And is there a difference between Jesus Christ and Jesus the Christ?
My take on that, because I grew up with a very famous book in Mormonism written by a man named James Talmage that used that particular term, Jesus the Christ. And it was asserting that Jesus was not just the man Jesus. In fact, in many ways, when people say Jesus the Christ, they're asserting that Jesus wasn't human, really. They're really asserting the divinity of. And most of my conservative friends will say that's not what they're doing, but it sure feels like what they're doing, right? That when they think divinity, they're thinking only the Christ figure, not anything beyond that. In any meaningful and real way. They'll talk about God the Father, even pray to God the Father, or they'll talk about spirit, but the whole of the real divinity for many of my conservative friends seems to be in Jesus. Yeah.
Interesting.
That's my take on things. Judy, how about you? What about Jesus compels you? You're muted again.
The phone rang. Sorry about that.
Yep.
I think the compelling part to me, of course, is his behavior with children, not excluding them, but wanting them to be part of what he was doing, or at least part of who he was. But I know what repels me. I mean, the crucifix in the Catholic churches and other churches has always just set me off in the wrong direction.
Sure.
Um,
Before you came on, we were talking, we'll get more to this later, but we were talking about that section of the New Christianity book that kind of says this was added, this was added, this was added, this was added through the centuries.
right.
And as ways of controlling.
And as I get to be this age, I realize he accomplished so much in such a short period of time. I mean, I'm more than twice the age of the time that he lived, and it's just amazing the kind of impact one person had.
Yeah.
That's the miraculous part to me, I think, is that one life could have made that much difference.
Yeah. And that is one of the amazing things about this, right? Why 2,000 years are we talking about Jesus in a pretty general conversation around the world, much more than almost anybody else from that ancient of a time?
I was wondering, Judy, if the reason that the crucifix bothers you is because it's showing Christ still on the cross. I've heard other Protestants say, that we believe in the empty cross. They make a statement like that, and or whether it's just that it's seems so cruel to have an image of him still on the cross. I was just curious about what bothered you about the crucifix.
I think it looks to me, and I haven't really spent a lot of time analyzing my responses, but I think it looks to me like defeat rather than victory. And his life didn't end the way I would have wanted it to had I been the playwright or whatever. But the impact was not limited by that ending.
Yeah.
Yeah.
His legacy is not one of defeat, for sure.
Yeah. And so in that way, it's a hopeful thing to me that even the rough places have value over time. But my dad was a really devout Catholic, and so my experience with the crucifix was anti my dad, and that was one of those things that I could hardly bear because I loved him so much, but I couldn't get past it.
Do you think that some of that is that by portraying Jesus as still on the cross, that it's to make guilt people into thinking, he's given everything for you. And if you keep seeing that's to remind you that of Jesus suffering more than all the other wonderful things about Jesus.
Yeah. The hard part about that, Pam, is it doesn't take the challenging images like a man hanging and bloody on a cross to do that guilt thing. Jesus loves you so much.
Oh, I
why
know.
don't you?
Yes.
Right. And that's a very positive trait of Jesus, but at the same time, it is used
As
horrendous
guilting
ways.
people. Yes.
Yeah. And I think we fall back to those things because they're easy control mechanisms.
We don't have to think about them.
But why do we continue to do that to each other as adults? Why are we stuck in that first grade mode of behavior control? And it's not even a good first grade mode, but that's what we're doing is we're treating each other like children.
But isn't that what the Catholic Church at least is about? I mean, the priests are father,
Yeah.
and the head nuns are mother superior,
Yep.
and the rest of us are children, and so we're being treated like children.
Sure. But that happens in Protestantism just as
That's
much,
right. It's
right?
just that their
in different ways. Maybe we don't-
their terminology supports that, whereas the treatment is still the same in the Protestant churches.
Yeah. And I think that at least part of what Bishop Spong is trying to say is let's grow up.
Yes.
Let's get past that. The problem is that when you've held on to something, maybe not for 2,000 years, but 1,500 years, or even 1,000 years, that's a long time to have repeated a certain story without it feeling like it's been forever. But because something has been forever, is it something that has to continue? Is what he's asking, right? And you heard, just like we talked about last week, it's the theistic God that he struggles with the most. So how does that play out in the figure of Jesus? Well, it's in things like he died for your sins. God came down, he did something miraculously for you. And so here's the steps you have to take. That's one of the things that never quite made sense to me. I can do lots of sacrificial things about Jesus, but died for sins never quite works for me. Partially because I have a different view of sin than what is typical. And he deals a little bit with sin, and we'll deal with it more later on. But for me, sin is not the really bad things that Pam does.
There are a lot of them.
Or the horrendous things that Judy does. It's the normal, everyday things that Jesus is calling me beyond, right? Instead of just driving by the guy lying beside the road, it's to stop and do something. Hi, Martha, how are you?
I'm okay.
Good to see you.
Been so long since I've seen you, Martha. It's so good to see you.
Hey, before I forget, go ahead.
I go to the soul meeting on Monday. That's the biggest thing I'm regularly attending, but
Oh, good.
yeah.
I'm glad you're going to that. Before I forget, remember that I want to remind you that I left a book on your desk in the library.
Okay.
And it's
It's
the
a
one,
library book or a
no,
contribution?
the one that Sam is passing along. And
Oh,
so
okay,
it's for
great.
you to read and then to put in the library if you want.
Okay, great.
Okay, so
Yeah.
so you'll see it real easily.
Yes.
Anyway,
Well, now I'm kind of without a vehicle. I have a vehicle, but it doesn't have a seat belt. So
Okay.
my daughter doesn't want
And the
me
way
to
you
drive it.
drive, Just kidding, just kidding.
Yeah. So I don't know what I'm doing, but yeah, I haven't yet found out how to use the, you know, the apps for rides and stuff
Like
like
Uber
that.
and whatnot. Yeah,
Uber and those guys, yeah.
yeah.
So Jim, you're guilty of sins of omission, but not sins of commission.
The truth of the matter is we're all guilty of lots of sin, right? In many ways. But I don't think Jesus was typically speaking to the murderers among us. He was speaking to the typical human being and calling them above that level. And yet we like to do the other, I think, for a couple of different reasons. One, because it makes for good control, right? If you're really bad, you're the worst of sinners over there, then, and I've got the solution of how to fix you, it's much easier to draw you to my space. And I don't mean that it's even just a profit sharing space, but it's become something that that is the worst way of defining Christ. It's Christ one that scares people into heaven. It's Christ one that, does that make sense? And yet that's what we do, is a lot of fear-based reward and punishment, which, you know, works, but any teacher knows that if you don't get past just reward and punishment, you're really not helping that kid grow up. And yet in religion, that's where we've stayed, isn't it?
Yeah, we're stuck.
And why is that place so comfortable to us? And why have we elevated Jesus to such a space that it's more about reward and punishment, a very low level reaction, than something better?
My brother-in-law and I have theological talks quite frequently. And one of the discussions has been about, you know, what people who study theology and like the Jesus group and all of that, who have looked at when articles were written and where parts of the scriptures have come from and everything. And many ministers, even if they're evangelicals, get some of that, at least when they're in theology school. Yet when they get to where they are giving the message in church, they go back to all the old teachings and don't try to make their congregations grow, to become adults.
Yeah, because it's simplistic. Let's take the season that we're in, leading up to Christmas. All of us can relate to a baby in one way or another. That's why it's such a compelling story. But it's really easy to take it just on a literal level, that a baby was born to Mary, and to turn it into the mystical. We've decided that we have to add elements like God somehow supernaturally impregnated her, rather than something that would keep it in the mystical, right? How do we continue to tell the story without becoming literal about it? And so we often take the easiest route. And I'm sorry about that, because that is one of the dysfunctions of my profession. We like to be liked.
Well, and I know in some churches where the churches themselves interview ministers
Yeah,
to come in.
yeah.
I would think that those churches would be even more like that, because the people who are there want the minister to come down with the law on their sinners in their congregation.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I think
Let's
that
make
makes it,
change happen, but don't make me uncomfortable.
yes, exactly.
Right?
And so I'm sure that that's part of the reason that there is no change happening in a lot of these evangelical churches, because the people who are in control don't want the change to happen at all. And
Yeah.
so they don't let the news out to the congregation that there are other ways to look at Jesus and God.
Yeah. Wonderful other ways.
Yes.
One of the things that I was struck by as I read through things this time was I asked the question in my head, because it feels like that theistic understandings were there before Jesus came along. And then they came along as the scriptures developed. He does a great job showing how it was an increasing sense of the theistic understanding. What if Jesus was just a momentary blip of what if it's not this theistic that is either before me or after me, but it's something different. Now, I don't know if that gives me hope or if it really saddens me, because if we're just rediscovering what he said 2,000 years ago, what hope is there to be able to propagate it? And I'm not saying we're the only ones that have rediscovered it. Maybe people have rediscovered that forever, but I'm really struggling in that area right now. How do we build something that says that this, and I think that Bishop Spong is right, that a theistic understanding is wrong, but how do we help that to become something that has the force that it ought to have? The force that I think compelled early Christianity, but then they slipped back into the easy stories that they already knew. Are we at a different space now? Is it like Bishop Spong asserts that we can't go back to that theistic thing? The church will die rather than go back, essentially.
I'm not sure it'll die as fast as he puts forth.
Yeah, if you read his stuff, it sounds like it's tomorrow.
Yeah. I just wonder if, excuse me, if the message that was growing after the crucifixion and until the final part of the canon was put in, if they deliberately were going to this theistic view, not because that's what they had before necessarily, although that I think that parts of the Jewish canon, it's theistic, but they understand it, that they understood it in a different way than modern Americans do by any chance. But where I was going with this was when they were trying to bring in Gentiles, whether some of these trappings that were added at the end of that first century were in order to intrigue those Gentiles into coming in and saying, look what we have.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have the living God among us. And I just wonder if that's why the progression from Mark to the John had such a great change in what the story was.
Here's the thing that's interesting about that, though, Pam. We don't have to be one that can make God appear in a phone book. We don't have to place that Judy can do that, and so in her is all of God. And yet that's what it seems like we did do with Jesus, is we decided to place all of God there. And in many of my more conservative friends and traditional friends' minds, nowhere else. That this is an event that is not repeated. It was a one-time event. Only in Jesus did the fullness of God appear. It's not the way I'm experiencing things. That's why I struggle so much with that, because I think what what that writing on Sunday meant about Judy is that in her, God appears. Whether it's the fullness or not, maybe we don't know, right? But Sandy sees and hears, sees the presence and hears the voice of God in that moment, right? And we can say that about other people as well. I think in your science and religion class, there's people that would assert that there we discover God together, that somehow God becomes real and present in that space. Why do we, I mean, the difference is we somehow put Jesus as a unique event rather than as a model for what we can be and do. And to me, that's what Bishop Spong is trying to do, because he talks about the difference between, maybe you've known the people who, and this is a critique of the progressive church by the conservatives, that you just say he was a great teacher. And for conservative, that's not enough. And so Bishop Spong is trying to say he's more than just a great teacher, but he's not God incarnate. Is there a middle ground? I hope that on Sunday you heard part of what I think. I think incarnation doesn't mean that a woman was pregnant with God's sperm and a child developed. That is not to me what incarnation is. Incarnation is where we listen to Martha and somehow from her mouth we hear God's words. Not all the time, maybe, but in some very real way, she becomes that voice of God. How about for the rest of you? I did a lot of talking there. Who is Jesus for you? Going back to our original question. What think ye of? And I guess just as importantly, how do we get to there from here? Not just individually, but how do we help each other to get there?
I would like to know how we can eventually help some of the more reasonable of our evangelical brethren to see that there is a way, there are other ways to look and still believe in the specialness of Jesus, that yes, he wasn't just a teacher. If that is their criticism of the progressive church. And I think that they're reading the progressive church incorrectly when they say that. I think there may be some churches that say that, but I think that they are making assumptions about all the progressive churches that is not necessarily a good assumption.
Yeah, but I think that's why Bishop Spong asserts so strongly his belief in Jesus.
Oh, very strongly. And he talks about how Jesus was everything to him growing up and still is.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important assertion that he makes in order to say, you can't say, I mean, no, they can. He's not going to say it that way. He's a bit essentially saying, I'm telling you that I believe in Jesus strongly. You cannot believe me, but I'm telling you, here's my truth. And sometimes we have a harder time doing that assertion for a lot of different reasons. We don't believe in the way that Jesus has been asserted by someone else. I told you about how I feel about the words, he died for my sins.
Yeah.
That's an assertion.
It gives me the creeps.
Yeah, that's an assertion I can't hold on to at all. But by not being able to assert that, I lose credibility. I wouldn't state that as strongly with my conservative friends. I would ask them questions around that, because as soon as I stated that, they wouldn't listen to me anymore. And it's not just conservative. I have to be really careful. It's not just conservatives that have a hard time with that. Traditionals would.
Yes, some traditionals in the mainline churches, definitely.
That's right. And so how do we have a conversation when I take away a central phrase and don't want to or won't use that, but it's just so central to them that they don't even think about it any longer, I believe. Do you have phrases like that, or pieces of Jesus that are just so central to somebody else's belief, but you can't hold on to it? What would they be?
I think one of the things that bothers, and maybe it's not a phrase, but that people attribute things to Jesus when they're trying to, control people that Jesus never said or did, and they forget about all the loving things that Jesus did.
Yeah.
And to me, even as a little girl, we did have the phrase, Jesus is love. God is love and Jesus is love. Somehow we've lost that love in those phrases. We're stuck in Jesus died for our sins and not, the love part.
Yeah. In my meeting this morning, we were talking about we came around to the turning over of the tables in the temple, right? And the phrase that was used was, some people believe Jesus never turns over tables, and other people believe that's all Jesus does.
I love it.
Right? And we both know both those kinds of people, because there's times when anger is the appropriate response, but it is not the definitive measure of Jesus, is it?
No.
And yet you probably know some people who use it more than what is appropriate from my point of view, at least. Any other images that for you are overused or not helpful?
Well, one of the things that bothers me is, especially with many Christian churches, not just evangelicals, that they still believe that Jesus is the only way to get to heaven, or whatever you think is going to happen.
I am the way, the truth, and the life. And
exactly.
That is only. Yep.
And forgetting about all the millions of people in the world who are Buddhists and Hindus and have other ways of looking at life. And to me, it has bothered me for quite a long time, really, but more and more as the years go on, and I see all the prejudices that come from Christian churches, that even if they recognize that someone is holy in their own religion, somehow they feel that they're just not quite there.
Yeah. So the key question about that, and Dr. Spong dealt with that in, I want to say chapter 6 or 7 of the New Christianity book. He essentially says, is Christ a singular event? Is the Messiah, is the anointed one, does it only happen once? And my conservative friends would say, well, yeah, you only have to save the world one time. But I don't think that's, they read that event as meaning it's only about saving the world. I don't need to save the world. I don't think that, I'm much more evolutionary, like Dr. Spong is, where he's seeing things as bringing us to greater and greater wholeness rather than to salvation. And so where else is wholeness happening? Well, there's no doubt that the Buddha brought wholeness and is continuing to bring wholeness, right? So did Christ, Buddhists would never say this, but did Christ, our image of Christ, also live in that time, that place? For me, it's an easy yes.
Yeah. I think that European Christians especially have a distorted view of the world anyway, without regard to religion. But then when you add their Christianity on top of it, it makes them feel even more like, well, you know, we're the best. You might do well, but we're the best.
Yeah.
And I don't get that when I'm reading Jesus' actual words, or what is attributed to Jesus, not who knows. But as portrayed, Jesus wasn't like that at all.
How much
And-
of that, though, is the tribal speaking?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And Bishop Spong was really good at saying Jesus was speaking against the tribal regularly.
Well, yes, and you know, the message that he sort of turned the Good Samaritan on its head for me, because I always thought this was a story to tell me I should be good to whomever. But the other side of that is he's saying everyone, even your enemy, can be good.
Yeah.
It's
Who
a
is truly
completely-
hearing God's voice here?
It's a
Essentially, right?
completely different message than what I thought I was getting all through those years.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still a good idea to help the stranger, but that's not the message that really is there, and it really struck me.
One of the things I really appreciate about Luke's gospel is his insistence that God is present in a larger audience than what we assert.
Yes.
And he does that in you know, Good Samaritan is only a Lucan parable, and it's remarkable in doing that.
I guess I'm doing too much talking here, but one of the other things you were talking about, as far as our science and religion class, I mean, we're talking about, would there be life somewhere else? What is that life going to be like? And then you get to the thought, well,
Did they have a Jesus?
do they have a Jesus? Do they have a religion? I mean, some science fiction things have put out that some of these groups have religions and things, and they're somehow very much like our religions, but for some reason.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, the good news is I have the answer to that. It's because Jesus actually was an alien who came down 2,000 years ago, changed this world to be able to make it more like the world where he came from.
that could be true, Jim. We don't know.
Well, but what's interesting about that assertion I just made is it doesn't sound that much different than what I think some people tend to say about the Jesus,
The real
without
Jesus
using the
story.
alien come down from outer space. It sounds an awful lot like what people assert about Jesus, doesn't it?
Born in a non-biological way.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Martha, you usually have a lot to say. I think maybe she left her phone for a minute.
Probably did. So what do we do about all this?
Yeah.
How do we move from that which we were taught and towards that which we desire? Not just in us, because for me, this is never a question of just how do I get there? Because I can get there. I can be there very happily for myself. But like you asserted about pastors before, we all sit in these social spaces where we have to decide how do we interact in that space, and our silence is an assent.
Mhm.
silent pastors have perpetuated a whole lot of this that Bishop Spong is fighting against. So what do we do?
And part of the problem is if a pastor should dare to start changing his message to his congregation, in some congregations, well, the result could be one of two things. They either get rid of the pastor or they all leave and form their own congregation with a new leader.
Yeah, you're not saying it the way I want to hear, and so I'm going.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest part of the problem. And the preponderance of different sects is a a testament to that, really.
Absolutely. And I don't think it's necessarily bad that there's different things. It's our reaction that makes those different sects that's bad, right? It's that I'm only going to listen to what I want to listen to.
Yeah.
And at least
Of course,
part
I do that politically, Jim, so I guess I shouldn't complain about
I
it.
know, we all do, because we like the comfort of what we do know. But at least part of what Bishop Spong is seeing happened in Jesus is that Jesus was a speaking beyond just the human being that he was. There was something else that he was tapping into and becoming in that moment, right? And called us beyond just the one man. And yet we do a lot of fighting against the one voice that calls us beyond, don't we? But at least part of why Jesus was effective goes back to what you said, Pam. He was both assertive and gentle. And we're often not both. We're either too passive, gentle,
Yeah.
or we're too assertive and dominating. And neither one of those by themselves will help as much. Although they will sometimes, the dominating, for example, will sometimes have a lot of successful campaigns at somebody else's expense, because you've chopped off their heads, right? Doesn't seem very Christ-like when we do it that way, huh?
No.
I think one of the other juxtapositions is the wisdom and the humility
Yes.
in Jesus. And that's just pretty incredible to me. But I've been thinking as we were talking about why pastors don't proclaim what they've been taught. And some of them, I think, very, I don't know if it's intelligent or not, but very cognitively decide that it's better to keep the church as a community and a family that might function even dysfunctionally, rather than call them to do this kind of hard work thinking. Because I think there are a lot of people who go to church just to be comforted. And they don't want to be challenged. That's not in their notion of what church is. It's just supposed to hold
Or
us
if they want to be,
time.
or if they step into the challenge sometimes, Judy, it's a challenge me to go out and feed this person, because I'll go do that. I'll take that step. I have a friend of mine who said that the church he was at, it was really easy to get people to go and stand on the opposite side of the table and hand food to somebody, but not to sit and talk to that somebody. Because the one would change a person deeper.
Well, and I think some people are embarrassed because they think that they're going to get a question that they can't answer.
Yeah.
Oh, there've been so many of those. I don't.
But I think it was last week, Bishop Spong asserted that we should never be embarrassed by that, because that's the very nature of what God is. God is the question beyond, right?
A friend of mine,
being
that again?
approached by a Christian at a dinner where we had a bunch of different people. And the guy asked me, why are there so many different religions in Christianity? And, so I had to take on that task of trying to explain.
Yeah.
And it made me realize, how complicated that is to other people who come like, Muslims, or, they have a couple sects, but they don't have 200 or whatever. So it
Yes.
was,
It's more like thousands, Martha.
I mean, it was a very interesting experience to me. It was at one of our dinners that we invited, a bunch of different people. And I love to be exposed to different people. And I like the PCIC experience that I had. Of course, I haven't been doing that much, but some of those experiences that take us out of ourselves and get those questions asked that we haven't thought about, So that was, and to try to have to answer that was very challenging.
Right. And that's because for me, at least, there's at least two things that add into it. We have a high value in Christianity on right answer, which means incomplete answer, right? But you have to assert it strongly. And so it has to be the only answer, right? And so if I'm asserting my right answer and you disagree with it, then of course we have to go form a new church. We have to separate because your right answer and mine can't sit.
Well, I came from a mixed parentage. One parent was Methodist and one parent was Presbyterian.
Yeah.
Oh my golly.
Yeah. And that can happen wonderfully and well, but through our history, we have often not allowed that to be true. Right. And it's because of that dynamic of we have to assert a singular right answer, and we have to if we can't agree, then we have to separate. And that's a deadly combination.
Yes, he froze.
Why is it that diversity is not accepted as a norm around us? And I don't mean any particular type of diversity. I mean that word in its most general sense. Why is it that men have to assert dominance over women? And in some ways, why do women assert that back in some ways, right?
There are matriarchal societies, however.
Yes, there are.
And one wonders whether the women are as dominant or whether they just take care of things and not, I'm really curious about some of the foibles that we all have in our society.
Yeah.
Is it completely reversed, or is it just parts of things that are reversed?
Yeah. I think those are good questions. And essentially that's at least part of what, for me, the Christ experience is that which asks me to ask questions like that and seek a different answer than what right now is my right answer. But we don't move to that space of new and bigger right answer very easily, do we?
No, and I think we make assumptions about things that when we are in a dominant society, we make assumptions about other societies, thinking that they operate the same way as our society does.
Yeah. Well, that's because God's speaking in our society and not over there.
Exactly right.
Right. That underlies much of Christian thought, at least, isn't it? Even if it's not spoken, it's definitely there.
Yeah. And if your country prospered, obviously the people in your country were acting with the way God wanted them to act.
Our belief system was the right belief system because
everything was going our way.
But then that goes back to reward and punishment.
Yes.
I got rewarded, so.
I must be doing something right. And there's a line like that in The Sound of Music.
Uh-huh.
Somewhere in my childhood, I must have done something good.
Yeah.
When he's, that is so ingrained in us.
So ingrained. So how do we re-envision it? And this is a big question that we're not going to answer today. We'll fix it up next week.
Good.
How do we envision Christ?
We got to finish it before our Christmas break.
There you go. How do we finish Christ outside of the reward and punishment space? How do we recognize Christ without having to have presents under the Christmas tree for me, type of thing, right? Because that's a lot of how we have formulated who is Jesus, right? The good news is you don't have to figure that out yet. But think about that. And as you do the readings this next week, if you haven't read the readings from the New Christianity book, I just found those very informative this week. So if you can read those. Martha, did you get all the readings? Did I send them to you?
No, I don't remember getting anything.
Okay.
I'm kind of a very on and off again attendee.
Okay, but what I'll do is as soon as I get off of here, Martha, I will send you the readings. But if you're not going to read all of them, which there's a bunch of them, do try to read the ones from the New Christianity book.
And I was just finishing up the chapter 8 one. I haven't quite finished it before we came on here. And it was in that one where Spong is talking about Tillich's idea of being. And I think that is something that I think I'm going to reread it because it's a little, it's new. You know, some of the other things as far as when the books were written and everything, it was a refresher thing of what was included. I hadn't looked at it quite the same way that he had. But the part about the churches adding some of their doctrines, because obviously growing up as a Protestant, I didn't know when all of these things came on or anything. And that was quite eye-opening.
Yeah. And the power about that is that it extends the idea that we were talking about earlier, that God didn't appear just in this one human being in the Holy Land back 2,000 years ago, but that God is in all being.
Yes.
Right. And the hard part about that is it extends way beyond just Judy being the only embodiment of God, as we know she kind of is.
She is.
To the
much larger. She's just like Jesus because she brings the little children to her.
That's right. But it's much larger than just any human being. It's not even our species being the embodiment of God, right? Wherever there is being, there is God present.
Yeah.
That's why I like sunsets, because that always reminds me of God. Right? That's why I like conversations like this, because it draws me beyond just my own conception of God. Even when you guys make assumptions that I don't make or draw me in directions that I haven't gone before, that's not a bad thing. If I don't stop myself and just start fighting, or right there. Right.
We got ending music today.
Listen to that. Nice.
Very nice.
All right, so continue reading. Like I said, if you can, read the chapters from New Christianity. I found them extremely informative. keep thinking. How do you envision Jesus outside of just reward and punishment?
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, my friends.
Bye.